anybody in here this morning a time scheduling kind of person? Where like you schedule your time and you want your day to go as sort? I am not that kind of person, just so you know. But does anybody in here know those kinds of people? Maybe you're like me, you're not that kind, but you know those kinds of people. You purposely interrupt their day to just watch them squirm as their time schedule falls to pieces. I'd be more on that end of things. I know some time scheduling people, but I was reading a book back in April called Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success, I think is what it's called. And in this book, this guy is proposing this idea that people who go about their day and really commit themselves to deep work, and what he meant by deep work was people who are really moving and innovating their industry. People who are really making big, like massive research findings and those kinds of things. He studied the habits of those kinds of people because he wanted to know what they do in order to accomplish this deep sense of work, this deep work that they go about their day with. And what he found was these people typically block off time in their schedule to accomplish said deep work. They'll block off chunks of time, 4 hours at a time maybe, where they commit to being uninterrupted, they commit to no distractions, and they commit themselves to being entrenched in deep work. Now I'm talking about more than just ticking boxes off a to-do list. I'm talking about work that is meaningful in the medical field, and work that is pushing universities forward, and work that is coming up with new inventions, that kind of deep work. And in my attempt, as I read this book, and in my attempt to put some of these things into practice, I had to do something that I never dreamed in a million years I would ever do. Listen, guys in the room, I'll give you my man card after the service. I had to buy a planner. If you've ever looked for a planner online, P.S., like, just on Amazon, you might find lots of those planners have flowers on them or are pink and purple. So I found the one that is black, and here it is. But I want to read something to you because I take great humor in this. As I said, this was back in April. This is from the week of the 15th through the 21st. And I just want to read, one of my days that I had scheduled this deep work or this idea of time blocking. So the first thing was plan. I had to write down in my planner time that I was going to plan. The second thing I put was read. I'm on a roll here, right? I got the planning done, I got my reading scheduled, and then the deep work comes. Deep work, you can see this big, well, you might not be able to see this. There's this deep work here. It says deep work discipleship. That's kind of what I do here at the church. I had great plans to uncover something magnificent about discipleship. And then I had this break of time that I didn't know what to put there, so I didn't put anything there. But then after that, I had a webinar that I was supposed to be a part of, and then I had Kale's soccer game, okay? This is the week of the 15th through the 21st. I think this was about when anyway, that I started reading this book, or I got to the point where I was starting to practice. But I just want you to take a gander at the following week. It didn't last very long. But what I came to realize is something that has also come to fruition as of late when I've been at the gym. I'll make this plan at the gym where I'm going to do these certain exercises, and I'm only going to take a certain amount of rest time, and I'm only going to be there for about 40 minutes, and then I'm going home, et cetera, et cetera. I make this great plan in the same fashion that I made plans here. But what I come to find is sometimes your plans get interrupted. Lo and behold, every single time I make a plan at the gym, there is somebody who knows. And they walk to the place where I'm trying to exercise right before I go there. And they interrupt my rhythm while I'm at the gym. And it's the same thing that happened when I tried to plan for a week. When I tried to plan my time here at work. When I planned my time here at work, I found myself interrupted more than I ever had. And here's what came about. And maybe this is true for you if you've ever planned something, you've ever had an agenda for something. Whenever I got interrupted, there was a real sense of frustration, of annoyance, of anger, not at the interruption, at the interrupter, the person, right? Oh man, it irked me. I was like, I don't even live this kind of life. But here I am getting annoyed and frustrated, so forth and so on. And so the natural part of when I discover something like this about myself, I'm always like, well, what's going on in my brain? Why am I like this? And so lo and behold, I was looking, at some brain research and what it tells us about agendas and time scheduling and those kinds of things. And lo and behold, agendas actually do something in our brain. They create a sense of a controlled environment. They create a sense of a controlled environment. And not just that, but controlled environments lead to predictable environments. I've learned to predict the environment when I schedule something. I'm getting interrupted. That's the prediction, right? But it leads to predictable environments. And predictable environments, they lead to a sense of safety and security. They lead to a sense of safety and security. And when I get interrupted, no matter what kind of agenda I've laid out, no matter how meaningless my agenda or time schedule might be, it represents something far more overarching than just time scheduling. In my brain, there is a sense of felt safety and security. Physically, there's a sense of safety and security. And here's what I've come to find out. Physical safety is a prerequisite. Like it comes before, it's the foundation for relational safety and security. One of the primary examples I could think of when I was thinking through this is the education system, and particularly public schools. Public schools know from research that one of the best predictors of healthy educational outcome or positive educational outcome is a healthy student-teacher relationship. It's a healthy student-teacher relationship. But as I just said, when it comes to relationship, one of the prerequisites for that is physical safety and security. And so schools, what do? They implement all kinds of rules and procedures, and they have school resource officers, and they go through all this great lengths to provide a sense of physical safety and security, because they know that physical safety and security are prerequisites to relational safety and security. And so teachers, they know this to be true too. And so they work to create a sense of safety and security with students. It's not just student-teacher relationships that this matters for, right? When it comes to children, if children can perceive a sense of safety and security with their parents, they form a really secure attachment to their parents. But if that's absent, it really promotes dysfunction. There's a real disintegration of relationship that happens when they don't feel safe or secure with their primary caregiver. But it's not just children. This is true of spouses. This is true of people that we're going to dedicate spending our lives with. If there's not a perceived sense of safety and security with that person, first on the physical side and then on the relational side, we don't decide to go into that relationship. As we talk this morning, and as we think through this morning, if you were with us last week, Bill introduced the idea of out of the box, my control. All right, so getting out of the box of my control. Today is out of the box, my agenda. But what I'm here to tell you is my agenda and my control are actually two sides of the same coin. They're two sides of the same coin. When I make this agenda that I'm looking to come about, when I come with something that I've set to do, it's two sides of the same coin. There's a deep desire for control, a deep desire for control of what will happen. And last week, Bill introduced, I think, a really helpful image for us. And I want us to revisit that image. He was telling a story about a tightrope walker, if you remember. The tightrope walker, I don't really remember his name. It was French sounding to me. Who knows if he's French? I don't know. But it was French sounding to me. And he was talking about this tightrope walker who's really, really great. And this tightrope walker would go out in the middle of the tightrope and he would sit down and eat his lunch, that kind of thing. Real weirdo, I guess. He'd go out there and sit down and eat his lunch, but then he came back and he would ask the people, how many of you believe, he would have this wheelbarrow. He said, how many of you believe I can take this wheelbarrow out across the line and bring it back? And of course, by this point, the crowd's like wowed and they're all raising their hands very, very joyously. Yeah, we believe you can do it. And then he asks a follow-up question. He said, the people raising your hand, How many of you are willing to get into the wheelbarrow as I push it along the line and bring it back? Today, what I want us to think about, when we get out of the box of my agenda, it's getting into the wheelbarrow. It's getting into the wheelbarrow. And so as we think through that and as we wrestle with that, I want you to know this. When God's agenda becomes your agenda, when God's agenda becomes my agenda, when we get out of the box of our agenda, God's supremacy becomes greater than our security. God's supremacy as God, meaning He has total control, all of our life, not just parts of it. When we give all of that over to Him, when we get out of the box of our agenda, God's supremacy becomes greater than our security. If you have your Bibles with us or with you this morning, I want you to turn to Exodus chapter 14. We're gonna be there. If you have a device with a Bible on it, you're welcome to use that. You're also welcome to follow along on the screen. Exodus chapter 14. But one of the things that I want to do before we jump into this story is I want to give you some background. Some of you may not know the story that we're jumping into, and so I think it's helpful sometimes, just from a context standpoint, to know what kind of story we're jumping into, okay? So at this point, we're jumping into the story of Israel when they've been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. All right, up to this point, they've been slaves for 400 years, and the ruler of Egypt at this time is a man named, well, I don't know if his name is, not his name, it's a guy who's Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's a nasty, nasty ruler. He's not just one of those like compliant rulers. No, he rules with an iron fist, and he rules with a very long whip. He rules the Israelite people. At one point in Israel's story, they begin to grow in number so much so that he has fear, Pharaoh has fear. And so in order to clamp down on them expanding as a people, he actually hires taskmasters over all the Egyptians and requires them to drive them harder than they ever have. Brick after brick, minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day, cracking the whip. So much so that at one point in our story, we'll see something that happens with a guy named Moses. But I don't want to jump ahead because we're not there yet. So Pharaoh, nasty, nasty ruler, sees that Israel is still expanding. They're still popping out babies left and right, okay? That's the actual problem for them. They're producing like wildfire. And here's what he promotes then from here. He assigns mass genocide over all of the Israel people. If a baby boy is born, he is to be thrown into the Nile, that's a river, he's to be thrown into the Nile and killed. Mass genocide of the Israelite people. This is Pharaoh. Now, there comes a point, as I said, a guy named Moses, but when Moses is born, his mother decides that she can't bring herself to throw him into the Nile. And instead what she does is she attempts to hide this baby for as long as she can. If you've ever been around a baby, I can't imagine trying to hide a baby for a week. She somehow manages to do it for 3 months by some miracle, right? But she does it for 3 months, and then she gets to a point where she can no longer hide the baby. And so what she does is she puts the baby into the Nile River, but before putting him into the Nile, she puts him into a basket that will keep the baby afloat in hopes that somebody will rescue this baby and have pity on it. And lo and behold, this little baby Moses who's floating down the river, not named Moses yet, little baby Moses floating down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter finds him. And Pharaoh's daughter takes pity on this baby. And Pharaoh's daughter calls a nursemaid to come and nurse the baby and then convinces Pharaoh to let her keep the baby. Names him Moses because it means rescued from the reeds, I think, or something of that nature. All right, names him Moses. So this is the beginning of Moses' story, but I told you there was something interesting about Moses. He actually catches the taskmasters driving some Israelites really harshly. So much so that it irks him to the point of fighting on behalf and then killing one. And so Moses has to flee from Egypt because he's now killed an Egyptian and he's fleeing from there. And while he's fleeing, God interrupts Moses' day in the form of a burning bush. How many of you have ever heard this story? Burning bush, right? Yeah, so God shows up in this burning bush and starts to speak to Moses. And this is what he tells him. Moses, I want you to lead my people, Israel, out of slavery. Out from underneath the hand, out from the iron grip of Pharaoh. I want you to lead them out. And I want you to deliver this message to Pharaoh. So Moses goes back to Pharaoh, delivers this message, and gets laughed off the stage, right? Why? Because Pharaoh's like, that ain't happening. Israelite people ain't going nowhere. I got bricks to be made. But God then miraculously intervenes through a thing called the plagues. Maybe you know this story. There's 10 plagues that God sends to change their mind, and it's not until the very last plague of the death of the firstborn that Pharaoh decides to let the people go. And as he decides to let the people go, and as Israel are fleeing Egypt, this is where we jump into the story. I know it took a while to get there, I'm very sorry, but here we are. That was 14 chapters of Exodus. You're welcome. All right, so we're jumping into this part of the story where they're fleeing from Egypt. And I want you to know, up to this point, the Israelites have had this agenda. They've had this agenda, and their agenda is going really well. God has delivered them. Now they're on their own agenda, fleeing from Egypt. If it were my agenda fleeing from Egypt, it would just be like, let me get out of here real quick, right? That'd be my agenda. Now, for them, it's very similar. Let me get out of here real quick. But as we jump in, God's going to get their attention. And God's going to say, if you're going to be my people, you got to get out of the box of your agenda. So Exodus chapter 14, here we go. Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back. Wait. To do what? That's right, turn back. We're fleeing Egypt, but he says turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon. So you shall encamp facing it by the sea. So not only is God saying turn back, but then he's saying set up camp. And God leads them to this place. He says, if you're going to be my people, your agenda must become my agenda. Toss yours aside. And what happens is he leads them to this place where, quite honestly, it's a really vulnerable place. Not only have they turned back to where they were fleeing from, but also they are now by the sea. That's a really, really vulnerable place for them. It's a really vulnerable place, but if you keep reading, it says something really interesting. Verse 4. Actually, verse 3. For Pharaoh will say to the people, or say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And here's the point of God's agenda. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, so the glory of God, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. The point of God's agenda is his glory, and people would know that he is the Lord. And at this point, the Israelites, they have a decision to make. Do we do this? Does God's agenda become our agenda? Or do we continue with our own agenda? But notice what it says, and they did so. And they did so. They've adopted God's agenda, and they did so. Now, sometimes, friends, when God's agenda becomes our agenda, and God's supremacy becomes greater than our security, sometimes God is going to lead us to places like this. Sometimes he's going to lead us to a place of vulnerability. Sometimes he's going to lead us to a place of being laid bare, of being exposed. He's going to lead us to those places, like he has the Israelites. Let's keep reading. Verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed towards the people. And they said, what is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him. And he took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel. While the people of Israel were going out defiantly, the Egyptians pursued them, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army. Pause. Essentially, Pharaoh gathers everyone that he can, his great army, and starts to pursue the Israelite people. The Israelite people are now encamped, and then it says this. End of verse 9, and overtook them encamped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. So here we are. They've camped out. They're sitting there waiting. And now the Egyptians have circled them. The Egyptians have cornered them, and they have nowhere to go. Now, as I noted earlier, I said that the prerequisite to relational security and safety is what? Physical safety and security. And at this point, what's happened to the Israelites' physical safety and security? It's come into great question, right? It's come into great question. But I want you to note the response of the Israelites. They've been encamped now. That's the end of verse 4. Let's jump in. That's the end of verse 9. Verse 10, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, see, they're not upset at the interruption. They're upset at the interrupters. They fear the interrupters, and then they turn and question what? They turn and question God, and they turn and question Moses. Their physical safety has gone, their physical security has gone, and they begin to question their relational safety, their relational security. Who is this guy, Moses? And listen to the things that they ask him. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Some of you may or may not know that Egypt as a nation specialized in graves. Or they specialized in them. And they dedicated 3/4 of their entire landmass to grave sites. So when the Israelites question Moses, they're not just questioning Moses. These aren't empty words. These are words of mockery to Moses. Have you brought us out of here because there's no graves in Egypt? And then the temptation for the Israelites is the same temptation that you will face when God leads you to a place of vulnerability and you begin to question things. Check out their response. Verse 11, they said to Moses, is it because there are no graves that you've taken us away? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is it not that we said to you in Egypt, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. The temptation that they face is to go back to the place of enslavement. The temptation that they face is God has led them out of this place of a controlled environment, of a predictable environment, and their temptation is to go right back to it in spite of the nastiness of it, in spite of knowing what had happened there. The temptation is, it would be better for us to be back in Egypt than to be here in this place and to die in the wilderness. Which tells me that they thought they were going to die in the wilderness. They thought they were going to die in the wilderness. And then Moses says something really great. Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Now, last week, I briefly mentioned the Passover, and I mentioned it again in our story, or as the precursor to our story. And here's why. Because the Passover happens, right? The last plague is when the Passover happens, and that's when God intervenes, and that's when Israel is set free. But during the Passover is the very first time we see God as a redeemer. It's the very first time we see this theology of redemption show up. It's the very first time that we see God as a redeemer God. The Hebrew word for redeemer is pada. I want you to turn to your neighbor. It's very fun to say. Turn to your neighbor and say pada. There was like 7 of you, right? Para. Para. To redeem is what that means. To purchase the freedom of a slave. That's the strict definition. But para. And the reason that's interesting is because God, after he padas the Israelites, leads them to this place, and this is the very first time in verse, is it 14, I think, or 13? When Moses, it's verse 13, and Moses says, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord." This is the first time where we see the theology of God of salvation show up. So we have, with the Passover, we have the God of the Redeemer God, and now in this story, the Exodus story, we have God of salvation. Coincidence? I think not. I think not. In this moment, God's supremacy is greater than their security. You see, the Israelites, they had an agenda up to this point, and I think they had an agenda for God. To lead them out of this place successfully, to lead them to a place of great freedom, and yet he's led them to a place of being cornered by the Egyptian army. You ever had an agenda for God? God let you down? You know, as a dad, one of the things that I have done with my kids, and maybe some of you can relate to this, one of the things that I've done with my kids after they've got to walking age is I like to bring them to that place where they're questioning my relationship to them, that place where you take them to the edge of something, and I'm down there and the baby's up here, and you encourage them to jump off into your arms. Any of you ever do that? My littlest, her name is Drew, and she is at that point where she loves to do that because she's already experienced that once. But I can remember the very first couple of times we did that, you could see the look in her face. The look of, Dad, if I do that, my sense of safety and security, it's really exposed. If you don't catch me off of this ledge, I fall. But here's the point. As a dad, the reason I want her to do that is because I know if she passes into that vulnerability and she trusts in me as a dad, when she does that and I catch her, she will experience a joy that she would have never experienced before. Sometimes passing into the vulnerability that God is calling us into is like that. Sometimes passing into the vulnerability that God is leading us into will lead to a life that we would have never experienced otherwise. Now, I don't want you to miss this. Up to this point, they've had 400 years of slavery, the Israelites have. And up to this point, that 400 years of slavery has significantly shaped them as a people. So much so that when the Egyptians are closing in, the fear for them is of the Egyptians. It's of the Egyptians. And so this idea that this 400 years has done nothing to the Israelites is really false. It shaped them into a kind of people. But God, when he leads us to a place of vulnerability, God, when he leads us into his agenda, he's working to shape us into a kind of people that he created us to be. Let's keep reading our story. Verse 15. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh." Again, God's glory. "I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." God's encouragement here is for Moses to split the seas. Now, how many of you have ever been around when water has rushed over the ground and then gone away? What's left behind on the ground? Anybody? Mud, right? Usually mud. And if you've ever seen like an instance where a river has rushed down and then left very quickly, sometimes it leaves behind the things that were in the river. Or in this case, the things that were in the sea, right? So I want you to picture this with me. You're the Israelite people. God is about to lead you across the sea, and into this place that God is leading you is mud and probably schools of fish flopping around on the ground, right? Trying to catch their non-air breath. What a strange story. What a strange place to be. God has called me into this place where I'm going to walk through this mud with these fish flopping around, probably a log or two with some seaweed. Who knows what kind of sea merchants live in there, right? God calls us into this place. But check out verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand. He does what the Lord says. Stretch out the hand over the sea. And the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. The people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Can you imagine being the Israelite who was stuck on the end? Walking by, and I really hope it stays. That's what's going through my mind. I really hope that wall stays. But here's the, verse 23 is actually the problem, if you will. Verse 23 is really interesting. Verse 23 says this: the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea. So we have God delivering us from being cornered by the Egyptians by parting this Red Sea. We're walking through, and as I turn to look back, lo and behold, the Egyptians are walking through too. And at that point, I'm yelling at my boy Moses. Moses, you idiot, get your hands down. This water's got to come down. Can't let the Egyptians come in too. Anyway, gets my heart racing. Verse 26, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians. Thank you, Lord. The water may come back on the Egyptians, upon their chariots and upon their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. And then you skip down to verse 30, or verse 31. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. In this moment of vulnerability, God takes their misplaced fear from verse 12 and 13, fear of the Egyptians, and returns it to what Solomon calls the beginning of wisdom. Solomon, a couple years later, a lot of years later actually, would write, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. God leading his people into this place of vulnerability led them to a place where they would not have been otherwise. A place where their fear was once misplaced but has been placed into the right area, the fear of the Lord. And God's salvation that Moses said they would see has now come. I want you to hear this. Salvation in the Hebrew, you didn't know you were coming to Hebrew class today. You're welcome. 2 words. Now you're fluent. Redeem is Pada. Salvation is Yeshua. Salvation is Yeshua. If you know anything about the Hebrew language and you've been around for a while, maybe you've heard this. But the word Yeshua is the Hebrew name for Jesus. The salvation that Moses promises in the midst of the sea is Yeshua. And in the midst of the sea, they find salvation, Jesus. That moment in the story where Israel began to become a new kind of people is the moment where they experience Yeshua, Jesus. Listen, don't miss this. Following God's agenda is not easy. At times it may be, but most of the time it's not. Most of the time, following God is going to pass us into vulnerability. It's going to pass us into vulnerability. But it also means being redeemed. Pada. And it means being saved and changed into the kinds of people God has created us to be. When you find yourself looking into the sea, when you find yourself looking into that place of God's agenda, when you find yourself on the brink of following him, you find yourself vulnerable. You find yourself laid bare. You find yourself exposed. And yet God calls us into that place. Listen, it's a fearful place sometimes, but fear the Lord. It's an uncertain place, but have certainty in the Lord. Sometimes it's a place of pain, but the Lord is healer. Sometimes it's a place of questions, but the Lord will and does provide. Sometimes it doesn't seem logical, but the glory will be the Lord's. It's a place that requires faith and trust, but the Lord is Yeshua. The Lord is salvation. When you find yourself being led into that place, here's my encouragement for you. Look to Jesus. You know why? God led Jesus to that place. God led Jesus to the cross. Jesus teaching up to the point of being led there was, if you want to be my disciple and if you want to follow me, you must take up your cross daily. And yet God leads Jesus to the cross, a place of very real physical vulnerability, a place of very real relational vulnerability. Don't miss this. It's in that place life over death happens. It's in that place that freedom over slavery happens. It's in that place that love over hate happens. It's in that place that masterpiece over broken pieces happens. It's in that place where joy over sadness, light over dark, truth over lies, Jesus over sin and death happens. Follow Jesus into that place. So when we follow God there, he padas us, we find his Yeshua, we find his salvation, and then we enter into a life that we would have never experienced before. A life of real trust in God. As we get ready to close this morning, I'm convinced that each person in this room has a Red Sea in front of them. Each person has a Red Sea in front of them. Last week, I think God began to stir the pot of the Red Sea for some of you. The pot of salvation, the pot of giving your life to God, the part of entrusting your life to the one who created it, the part of making Jesus Lord. He started to stir that pot last week, and today he's laying that sea of salvation in front of you. Will you enter it? For others of you, I think God is regularly calling you to a place of relational redemption. A place where you have to come and be laid bare. A place where you have to confess some things. A place where you have to ask for forgiveness of some things. And it sure feels like a sea of vulnerability. We live in a culture full of men who are addicted to fake love in the form of pornography. We have a culture of young men who are being raised addicted to the same thing and being addicted to fake action. Fake action in the form of video games. For some of you, the sea is to get off your recliner, to step into a place of vulnerability, to confess, and to move forward relationally. For others of you, I think you find yourself very much like the Israelites. You have this Egyptian army who's closing in on you, and you have no options. You can't go into the sea, so you're just preparing to fight. Preparing to fight on your own. And you've done that for a long time. You've fought on your own. But I'm here to tell you there's a mission that God invites you to. There's a mission that that instead of fighting on your own, you can join in on. There's a story of redemption that will bring about not just redemption of your life, but redemption of the creation that he invites you into. Some of you in here, for the price literally of a game of golf, you could forego that once a month and sponsor a kid through Compassion International, sponsor a kid through Food for the Hungry. Literally provide life-giving things to an orphan across the world who would not get it otherwise. We vote pro-life with our ballots, but I'm asking you to vote pro-life with your money. Provide actual pro-life opportunities for people who wouldn't have it otherwise. For some of you, that's the actual C God might be calling you to. There's a place that we partner with here in Springfield called Choosing Hope Adoptions. Again, we vote pro-life on our ballots, but I'm encouraging you, maybe you need to vote pro-life with your actions. Maybe you need to step into the burden, step into the opportunity of foster parenting or adoption. Listen, I don't know what your C is. I don't know where you find yourself today, but I am convinced that there is a C for you to step into. There is a vulnerability that God is asking you to step into, out of your own agenda, into his. And you have a choice to make today. As the band comes back out, they're going to sing a song. During that song, if you'd like to talk to somebody, if you'd like to step into that place, but you don't want to do it alone, which I would encourage, I'd invite you to come back to our Next Steps area. They're back here in the back of the room. There's people there who are willing to pray with you, willing to lock arms with you, walk with you into the mud, into the fish who are flopping around, into that place that seems really, really strange and very, very scary. Willing to walk with you into that place. I'd encourage you as we stand and as we sing to go to connect with somebody at our Next Steps area. Before we do that, I want to pray. So if you would, please stand with me. Join me in praying for those things. But I want to leave you with this question. If God were to have complete control over a given area in your life, what area in your life do you most fear his control over? And when you answer that question, you're going to find the C. You're going to find the C. And in that C is Yeshua. And I pray you find him. God, your story of faithfulness for the Israelites, it's not just for them. Your story of faithfulness for your people and shaping them into the kinds of people that you created them to be is not just for them. It's for us today. Lord, somebody here this morning faces that sea. Somebody here this morning needs to step into that place. It's not just someone in the crowd, God, it's me. Lord, may we step into that place and find Yeshua. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.